Hello. We're back to reading about the I Survived the Great Chicago Fire. And I gave you a clue yesterday about where Chicago was, and I misspoke. It's in the state of Illinois. So if you've had a chance to get out a map and take a look at Illinois. Chicago is the biggest city there. So our story started with a fire, and our main character, Oscar, is caught in a fire. But then it flashed back to the hours leading up to that, and we learned that Oscar and his parents lived on a farm, and his father had died, and his mother had remarried a man named Mr. Morrow, who's from Chicago. And they moved to Chicago on a train, and the very first day a fire broke out. So we're starting chapter 3. Oscar stared out the window in shock as the train pulled into the city. Chicago is called the Queen of the West. What an ugly queen. All along the tracks were factories and warehouses. The sky was smudged dirty brown with coal fires and dark clouds burping out of smokestacks. Soon enough, they were off the train and standing in an enormous station hall. Every other person smiled and waved at Mr. Morrow. "Charlie," a man boomed. "Welcome back, Mr. Morrow," said a porter, lugging his heavy suitcase. "Mr. Morrow, we loved your latest pictures," a pretty woman gushed. "Good to be back," Mr. Morrow beamed. People swarmed around the station, more people than Oscar had seen in all his life. Everyone was rushing around as if they were late for church. And suddenly, Oscar noticed the rotten stench that filled the air. He had never smelled anything so disgusting. It was like someone had tossed 100 skunks into a hot outhouse and left them for a month. Oscar could see from Mother's crinkled up nose that she noticed too. "The slaughterhouses," Mr. Morrow said, reading his sickening expression. "They butcher more hogs in Chicago than anywhere in the world." Mr. Morrow went to the baggage room and returned with their 3 suitcases. Oscar's was the smallest. Inside was all that was left from his life on the farm. His few clothes and his prized possession, Papa's sheriff's badge, a 5-point silver star. "Is there somewhere I can freshen up?" Mama asked, smoothing down her golden curls that had popped out of her bun. "I'll show you," Mr. Morrow said, taking Mama's arm. "Oscar, can you keep an eye on the bags, please?" Oscar nodded. But as they disappeared into the crowd, Oscar's heart thumped. He felt so out of place and strangely all alone. A bunch of rough-looking boys looked around. One of them stared at Oscar. He had bright red hair and strange orange-tinged eyes that reminded Oscar of a rattlesnake. Oscar was relieved when they drifted away. He took a deep breath and looked around, thinking about Papa's one visit to Chicago. Papa was just 20 years old at the time. His parents had both died, and Papa decided to leave his hometown near Boston and head west. "I was looking for my fortune," Papa had said. He landed in a no-name town of Dakota Territory. The town was desperate for a sheriff, and Papa needed a job. For months the place was quiet, until the night a gang of outlaws rolled in. Their leader was earless Max Kildare. Actually, Earless did have one ear, Papa had explained to Oscar. He lost the left one blowing up a safe during a bank robbery. Papa heard that Earless Kildare was a killer, and sure enough, by morning the town's bank had been robbed and one of Papa's friends was sprawled out dead in the street. Earless and his gangs were long gone. Papa went after the gangster, chasing him all the way to Chicago. He finally found him in a stinking tavern near the river. Papa pulled out his gun, ready to arrest him, but Earless was too quick. He jumped behind the bar and started shooting. Pow! The bullet whizzed past Papa's head. Pow! Pow! Papa fired back but missed. Earless lunged forward with a final shot. Pow! The bullet hit Papa in the chest. It should have torn a hole right through his heart, but it ricocheted off his badge instead, leaving a big dent smack dab in the center of the star. Earless escaped in the commotion. After that, Papa decided that he was done chasing outlaws. He heard about free farmland up for grabs in Minnesota. He'd never farmed, but he figured he could give it a try. He ended up in a little town called Castle, where the first person he met was a freckled-faced schoolteacher with the prettiest blue eyes Papa had ever seen, Mama. Within the month, they were married. By the next year, they had their farm and Oscar. So I found my fortune, Papa liked to say, kissing Mama on the cheek. As for Earless, he was still on the loose. Papa heard he was in Chicago, laying low, but still up to no good. Oscar's thought of Papa were cut short by a whispered voice. Can I help? Can you help me? He looked down at a skinny little girl with a yellow cap over two raggedy braids. She stared up at him with big brown eyes. I've lost my parents. She looked so helpless. We'll find them, Oscar said, standing a little taller. I think they went this way, she said, leading him by the arm out of the main waiting room. And then suddenly she let go of his sleeve. Sorry, she said, and then poof, she disappeared in the crowd. An uneasy feeling grabbed hold of Oscar. Something wasn't right. He spun around and rushed back to the suitcases. They were gone. Chapter 4. 30 minutes later, it's now 9 p.m., and they're in the Illinois Central Train Depot. Those street kids are vicious, the policeman said. He looked down at Oscar. Son, you're lucky you didn't get stabbed. Mama, Mr. Morrow, and Oscar stood with the policeman on the spot where their suitcases had been. The cop, Officer Brennan, was an old buddy of Mr. Morrow's. He explained that Oscar had been tricked. That little girl wasn't really lost. She was a crook, part of a band of thieves. She distracted you so the others could steal the suitcases, Officer Brennan said. Happens here every day. Officer Brennan and the three other cops had already scoured the station, but there was no sign of the girl or the bags or those rough boys Oscar had seen. Oscar told the policeman about them too, including the red-headed boy with the strange eyes. Otis Weber, the cop said, his friendly eyes narrowing. He's only 14 years old, but he's got a heart of a killer. We hear he works for an older guy. They take helpless orphans and turn them into ruthless criminals. Oscar shuddered. Will you find our suitcases, Mama asked. Doubtful, ma'am, he said, giving them all an apologetic smile before he left. Mr. Morrow put his arm over Oscar's shoulders. I should have warned you, he said. In a big city like this, there are a lot of bad characters. What's done is done, Mama said, shaking the worry from her face. We can all get new clothes. What matters is that we are all here together. Mr. Morrow beamed at Mama. Oscar ducked out from under Mr. Morrow's arm. Oscar didn't care about his clothes. All he cared about was Papa's badge, which was gone forever. It was past 10 p.m. when they finally got out of the station and into a cab. A beat-up buggy pulled by a dusty horse. The cab driver flashed a smile filled with black teeth when he saw Mr. Morrow. Charlie, he cried, welcome back. Was there anyone in Chicago who didn't know Mr. Morrow? Hello, Joseph, Mr. Morrow said, patting the man on the shoulder. Take us up to the Palmer house, please. Joseph let out a sharp whistle. Woo, fancy. We're having supper there, Mr. Morrow told Mama and Oscar. Then we'll head home. Oscar, I think you're going to like the house. My father built it. It's a little far away from things north of our new park. The best room is my studio. You can look out the window and see all of Chicago. Oscar managed to nod and bite his tongue. Mr. Morrow's house would never be home. Home was Papa's farm, where the air didn't smell like dead hogs, where the only thieves were the rabbits that stole carrots from the garden. The horse clattered away from the train tracks and the warehouse and onto a wide avenue of grand buildings. Oscar tried not to act like he was impressed, but these buildings were taller than any tree he'd ever climbed. Amazing, isn't it? Said Mr. Morrow, smiling. When I was born, this city was just a little town on a marsh. Today, Chicago is one of the most important cities in the world. It's beautiful, Mama said. But suddenly, Mama's expression darkened. Does the sky look odd to you? She asked, her brow wrinkling with worry. Oscar saw it too, a pale orange glow in the sky. Must be a fire, Joseph said matter-of-factly. We're having fires practically every night now. Hasn't rained here in months. The city is bone dry. The word fire sent a flash of fear across Mama's face, and it jolted Oscar too. 3 years ago, a massive forest fire had erupted in the woods north of Castle. It burned thousands of acres of pine and birch trees and then raced across the prairie toward Castle. Dozens of buildings were burned, including Oscar's barn. The entire town could have been lost, but just as the flames were lapping at the edge of Main Street, a big rainstorm blew in and doused the fire. "Don't worry," Mr. Morrow said, giving Mom a reassuring pat. "Chicago has one of the best fire departments in the country. We have close to 200 firemen and a fleet of the best new steam pumpers. That fire will be out before we can finish supper." The cab lurched to a stop and Joseph turned around. "Oh, here you are, folks, the Palmer House Hotel, finest in the city." They climbed out of the cab, and a man in a top hat opened the hotel's huge front doors. Oscar peered inside to a glittering lobby. Bright lights twinkled and piano music filled the air. Oscar lingered outside. He'd never seen such a fancy place, and he wasn't sure he belonged in there. Oscar glanced back at the street, tempting to bolt away to the train station. And that's when he saw her, the little girl scurrying down the sidewalk. Even in the flickering gaslight, there was no mistaking that dirty yellow cap and those raggedy braids. "There she is," Oscar called out. But Mama and Mr. Morrow were already starting across the lobby, and Oscar's shouts were drowned out by the music and the hum of the chattering crowd. The girl moved quickly across the sidewalk, and before he even realized what he was doing, Oscar was dashing into the street. He had to catch that little thief. I wonder what's going to happen. Next time, we'll start chapter 5. See you then. Bye.